This is a story of our time. In some ways, the story of our time. Entombed beneath the pavements of a city's street, you'll find them. The invoices, documents, and files. Dead statements. Yet they record the wondrous progress of our age. That's how the whole thing started, with a few letters and an agreement made by a man called Darcy. The year 1901.
An agreement to search for, obtain, render suitable for trade, carry away and sell petroleum. Full extent of the Persian Empire, except the 5 northern provinces. Just about then, Darcy granted me a concession, which was the privilege of going out there. You'll like it, he said. It's different. Well, Persia was different. But our objective lay not in the cities, but way beyond, up in the hills. The Persians have a phrase, the sting of the sun. And in all our travels, we had reason to believe it. For a man to cross that country unhampered was bad enough. What we faced was near murder. The Persian Empire was an awfully big place, even without those 5 northern provinces. The man in charge was G.B. Reynolds, a fine man, sensitive. In some people's eyes, a difficult man. Back at head office, they didn't know which they disliked most. Reynolds' periods of silence, which were frequent, or his reports when they came. Reports like these. Thousands of grasshoppers have chosen the stream as a graveyard. One of the chiefs is as full of intrigue as a nightingale's egg is pregnant with music. Will head office please arrange to send out McConnelly's mother? We knew there was oil in Persia because the old surface seepages showed it. But could we strike it in commercial quantities? Reynolds had a hunch for the south. The geologists recommended the north. And in 1902, the first exploitation company was putting up its first derricks 300 miles northwest of the Persian Gulf.
So the noise and bustle of newborn enterprise shattered the silence of the Persian hills. Down through the timeless sands, through the rock that cut their primitive drills to pieces. Hot metal, dust, bad water, dysentery, and plain homesickness. Simple tools and simple courage. Out of such beginnings comes progress.
6 long years went by, and we were still at it. We tried here, we tried there. There'd been a spurt in the north, but the oil had dried up. It was called the Syndicate now, not the Exploitation Company. But it was the same desert. Now we were working in the south, within sight of where Reynolds had first said. But the cash and the patience back in London were running out. It was to be here or nowhere. And then...
I am directed by Secretary Sir Edward Grey to inform you that he has received a telegram from His Majesty's Chargé d'Affaires in Tehran reporting that the operators of your syndicate have struck oil at 1,200 feet.
Yes, we'd struck oil. But striking oil was one thing. Finding a market for it was another. But we had one big potential customer. For some time, the British Navy had been slowly turning away from coal. In the view of the head of the Admiralty, a man called Winston Churchill, any real naval supremacy must be based on oil. Well, we'd got the oil, so we got our customer. Now, the only thing was to deliver. Hacking and blasting hundreds of miles of roads out of the hard rock of the hills, bringing up every tool and every screw by mule and wagon, through the rivers and along the rough tracks, where there were any tracks, and where there weren't, we had to carry the stuff as best we could. Delivering meant pipelines, miles of them, laid over the hills and across the desert plains. The gear was often crude in the extreme, and yet, considering all things, wonderfully effective. The rest was toil, sweat, and faith in the job. It had taken us no less than 12 years since Darcy's agreement to get the first oil away. And little did we know it, it had all been a race against time.
At first, the wheels of war moved slowly in well-worn ruts. But gradually, war called for all we had: men, women, and machines. Now, for the first time, the petrol engine drove into battle, to revolutionize war, and to revolutionize itself in the process.
And by now, oil was coming steadily from Persia, down from Tembe pumping station, down the long pipelines, over the hills and across the desert, to Abadan. Abadan. Just a few chimneys and boilers on the sandy shores of the Shatt el Arab River. There, in crude stills, we were refining. A bit hit or miss by modern standards, but refining all the same. Off the jetty, we had our first specially built tankers, loading for the long trip to Europe and the battlefronts. Meanwhile, in the struggle to keep abreast, we were expanding, building, improving. For ours was the stuff that, in the end, did much to bring us victory.
And when it was over, we knew the world could never be quite the same. We turned our caps back to front, fixed our eyes on the road ahead, for we were determined to be different, if it killed us. Maybe some of our ideas were a little large, but behind the sometimes airy notions, one could feel a sense of progress as solid as the tires on a London bus. Slowly, oil was seeping into our lives, laid on like any other modern convenience.
The spirit of the 20s didn't pass us by in Abadan either. We were quite a community now, with social amenities. We even had a police station, if you can call that a social amenity. And to be quite up to date, we had a cinema. Silent, of course, except for the pianist. Aye, we had a little fun. Regattas on the pump house pond, and kidding ourselves it was Henley. Most of all, I remember the bustling energy of it all. The sense of pioneering, expansion, of sheer endeavor that prevailed.
The mood of the oilmen reflected the mood of the world, and new horizons awaited both. By now, the ships whose very shape proclaimed their business were sailing the seas in greater numbers. To France, Belgium, Norway, Germany and all Europe. To Australia, India, New Zealand, the Far East. Bunkering installations were set up in major ports all around the world for the ships now turning fast to oil. Expansion in places far away from Persia. Refineries in France. And in Britain, the first big oil refinery in South Wales. And wherever oil went, once again there was pioneering, distribution, marketing. Once again, enterprise, settled, established, ever-growing. For this wondrous stuff called oil is always a driving force, not only of machines, but of ideas in the minds of men. First, the pioneers, taking the risks, making it safe for others to follow. Then, adaptation, consolidation. Oil and the world were going forward together.
It's remarkable, looking back, how closely our history did reflect the general history of our time. Take the year 1933. That was a milestone for us all. It certainly was for us. That year, a new agreement was drawn up with the Persian government, revising the terms of the old Darcy Agreement. Darcy, who died in 1917. I wonder whether he realized what he'd started. By now, we knew where Reynolds had only been guessing. We knew, for instance, that there were some pretty terrifying forces loose down there. If we hadn't been lucky in Reynolds' day, we'd have blown ourselves to pieces. Now we had the tools, the know-how, and the equipment in a really big way. And the place was beginning to look like it. Yes, by now, there were a few more boilers and chimneys on the shores of that Middle Eastern river. Abadan, the greatest oil refinery in the world. By 1933, an enterprise producing over 7 million tons of oil a year. And now, in those uneasy years before the war, there was more venturing forth, seeking fresh fields and pastures new, sending echoes down through the virgin rock. And by the answer that we got, plotting, pinpointing, deciding. Choosing from vast areas 100,000 square miles, for that was the zone laid down in the new agreement. And by 1938, we'd done the choosing, and our choice was sound. New and fruitful fields were opened up, and soon we were laying miles of pipeline to cope with the steady increase in production, to carry away the oil from the new fields at Haft Kell, Agajari, and Lali. Yes, by 1938, from all our enterprises, 10 million tons of oil were flowing through each year to Abadan. There too the plant was growing, expanding, building, not only to deal with the flow of oil, but to put into practice new ideas and new conceptions, finding out ways of making the most of this stuff called oil, ways that were to prove vital when, once again, it came.
And this time when it came, the wheels of war had left forever their time-worn ruts. War, like oil, was fluid, mobile, reflecting the tempo and the habits of the modern world. And when death struck, machines like dying soldiers lay helpless as their lifeblood drained away into the sand. The tide of war reached Persia, and there was action, even death, to write upon the record. To an enemy thirsting for oil, the fabulous towers of Abadan glittered truly like those of an Eastern fable. Towards them, he reached out avidly. But like any Eastern mirage, they were to remain forever unobtainable. Towards the close of 1941, British troops marched in. For 2 years, a vital oil supply had been half strangled by the tentacles of war. Now, safeguarded, this mighty plant was free to harness its vast resources to the urgent task at hand, to become the very pulse and strength of the Middle East Allied war machine. Drawn forth from the desert, oil from Abadan powered lorries and tanks in a desert far away. Helped once more to make another desert of arrogance and pride, now humbled in the dust.
Now a new chapter began, both for the world and in a special sense for us. In 1946, the great Kuwait oil field came into production. In Iraq too, the pumps roared again, shifting the oil from the Kirkuk fields to the Mediterranean. We were busy. All over the world, the cars were on the roads in increasing numbers, and we were in the petrol business again. The war was over, and we had to readjust ourselves, think afresh. For the world and its demands for oil had changed. Once more, the familiar road tankers were seen bearing their welcome load across the frontiers so lately closed. Oil was coming from fields both old and new, with a market waiting avidly. But to bring the two together, we needed ships, tankers. An intensified program was now planned and carried out. 40 ships had been lost in war, and in the few years that were to follow, British shipyards rang with the noise entailed in making good that loss. 13 new ships in 1946, 10 in 1948, 15 in 1950, including supertankers. And then, with losses made good, well, we should have known by now that the oil business can never be plain sailing. Aye, At one blow, we lost our greatest source of supply and the largest oil refinery in the world. We're back there now with compensation and a 40% share in the Persian operations. But we were not to know that then. Regardless of the reasons and the rights and wrongs, one thing was clear. Oil is always a target, caught up in the surging nationalism of the countries where so often it is found. Truly indeed, oil is the story of our time. Idle to deny that for any company, however large, this leave-taking was a shaking climax to 50 years' endeavor. Idle to deny, too, that those 50 years had wrought much change in Persia. Schools, hospitals, and the like. Indeed, it was our first medical officer, Dr. Young, who had become the best known and best loved Englishman in Persia all those years ago. And in the intervening years, generations of British people had devoted their lives to bringing benefits to millions they would never know in Persia and beyond. For them, as for those early pioneers, Abadan and Persia generally had become a way of life, albeit a little softened, that now it seemed was ended.
Chosen the stream as a graveyard.
Head office, please arrange to send out.
The drillers are working in shifts without pause, and the suspense for those of us who know the truth is almost
That the operators of your syndicate have struck oil at 1,200 feet.
Well, there it was. Goodbye, or so it seemed, to Abadan and the achievement of 50 years.
As a company, we had no time to brood. The answer was, build new refineries. And build them we did. From Aden to Scotland, Australia, a worldwide program. Grangemouth to Kent, Lavera, Antwerp, Dunkirk. We'd stepped up Kuwait production, our major source of supply, and were building the refineries to deal with it. And by 1955, we'd surmounted a tremendous crisis. Production up to 46 million tons compared with a low 25.5 million in 1952. The policy of building refineries in consumer countries, started before the Abadan crisis in point of fact, now more than justified itself. Soon, new groups of twinkling lights were changing the landscape in many parts of the world, and oil was flowing once again from Persia. The tankers were busy, sailing the seas of the world, transporting the crude to lonely harbors that heretofore had never seen their like. And then, with one major crisis behind us, came crisis number 2. The clouds were gathering, and soon we were carrying oil on what, I'm afraid, became rather troubled waters. Yes, Suez. Another chapter in the story of our time. If anyone by now was in any doubt as to what exactly oil had come to mean to the modern world, this brought it home to them. But we'd been trained to cope by now, and we got round it. The Cape, I mean. For us, it was essentially a maritime problem. Yes, another challenge. And once again, the oil industry demonstrated its flexibility and adaptability to a watching and vitally interested world.
Back once more to days that, if not always sunny, take us to some pretty hot and steamy places. Shades of Reynolds and Darcy. Oh yes, if you yearn for pioneering in the old style, it's still there. Plenty of it. And yet there's excitement in the most unlikely places. It's there, behind the concrete formality and the morning mail. For here is the real glory. The interests, the enthusiasms, and the grumbles. The record of what men are doing now to keep a mighty enterprise alive. For oil is not made, it's got. From that will always spring its huge and rough vitality. Oil thinks large. Oil thinks wide. Oil is where you find it. Whether it be amidst the snows of Canada or sweating it out in some steamy tropical river. Indeed, on the very bed of the ocean. And if you don't find it, well, maybe you'll find yourself. For oil is a trying taskmaster. And when you've found it, you can be carrying it to any part of the world. By the shipload north to Norway, or south to Fremantle. Through the canals of Holland, beneath the castles of the Rhine. Distributing and marketing in Africa, up amid the snows of the Alps, or to primitive villages on the sweltering equator. Or maybe your pioneering takes a different twist, into even stranger fields. And here, there's no limit. Or there's something else you can be doing. Fostering the growth of whole communities, new towns, villages, schools, homes. For progress, too, is where you find it. And progress can only be measured by what was there to start with. There, too, you can build, or help somebody else to build. Create foundations for something even more enduring than an oil refinery or a tanker.
An enterprise is but a company of men, a gathering of human beings. And the sum total of their efforts is to achieve a better life. And in doing it, to provide an outlet for men's energies, their urges, their talents, and their dreams. Once, there was a man called Darcy who had a distant dream. And that, as we have seen, came true and saw the light of day.